The old pickup truck rumbled to a stop on the crunchy gravel parking lot of Pine Creek Shooting Range. The woman behind the wheel took a deep breath, her hand still gripping the steering wheel tightly. People might have guessed she was in her early 40s, though the laugh lines around her eyes told stories of both joy and hardship. Her simple blue cardigan and comfortable pants made her stand out among the sea of tactical vests and camo patterns worn by most visitors. She glanced at the small black case sitting on the passenger seat. The leather was worn at the edges, polished, smooth by decades of handling. Her father's hands had carried this case for 30 years before his passing 3 months ago. Now it was hers, along with the treasured pistol inside. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, for Dad. The shooting range buzzed with Saturday morning activity. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the property, mixing with bursts of laughter and loud conversations. Groups of friends and regulars huddled together, comparing equipment and swapping stories. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air like a familiar perfume to those who frequented the place. As she walked toward the check-in building, the worn leather case clutched carefully in her right hand, she couldn't help but notice the sideways glances. Eyes would flick in her direction, take in her ordinary appearance, and quickly dismiss her. One bearded man even nudged his buddy and whispered something that made them both chuckle as she passed by. The check-in counter was manned by a youngish fellow with a buzz cut, who barely looked up from his phone when she approached. His name, tag read Doug in bold letters. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather be doing anything else. "I'd like to use the range today," she replied, placing her father's old membership card on the counter. The plastic was faded, but the range logo was still visible. This got Doug's attention. He picked up the card, eyebrows rising slightly. "This is an old lifetime membership," he noted, suddenly more interested. "But it's not in your name." "It was my father's. He passed away recently." She pulled out the transfer paperwork she'd completed weeks ago but hadn't found the courage to use until today. "I've filled out the forms to transfer it." Doug studied the paperwork, then her face, as if trying to see a family resemblance to some old-timer he might have known. "First time shooting?" he asked, his pen hovering over the sign-in sheet. "Not exactly," she replied with a small smile. "But it's been a long time. My father taught me when I was young." Doug nodded and stamped her paperwork. "Lane 6 is open. Basic safety rules are posted everywhere. Don't point your weapon anywhere except downrange, keep your finger off the trigger until ready to fire, and always assume every gun is loaded." "Thank you," she said, taking back the now official membership card with her name printed in the corner. As she made her way toward Lane 6, the looks from the regulars became more obvious. She wasn't what they expected to see at the range on a Saturday morning. A group of 3 men standing near the equipment rental counter barely tried to hide their amusement as she walked past. "Careful with the kickback, honey," one called out with a smirk. "Those things aren't like the water pistols at the fair." She didn't respond, just kept walking with her eyes forward and back straight. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her memory, "Never let them see you flinch." At the far end of the range stood a tall man with broad shoulders and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Everyone seemed to know him, nodding respectfully or calling out greetings as they passed. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely in his element. The paper targets hanging at his lane were all marked with tight clusters of holes dead center, evidence of exceptional skill. This was clearly the range champion, the man whose record had stood unbeaten for years. She had heard about him from her father, who had mentioned the hotshot who thinks he owns the place during their last conversation about the range. The champion was entertaining his usual crowd of admirers, demonstrating his technique with exaggerated motions. When he spotted her setting up at Lane 6, he paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing slightly at the unfamiliar face. Then he noticed her struggling with the ear protection and grinned, elbowing his friend and nodding in her direction. They shared a laugh before returning to their conversation. She carefully placed the leather case on the small counter of her assigned lane and unzipped it slowly. Inside, nestled in molded foam, lay her father's pride and joy, a classic 1911 pistol that gleamed with the shine that comes only from decades of loving care. He had kept it immaculate. Next to it sat 4 magazines and a box of ammunition, all arranged precisely as he had always kept them. Her fingers traced the grip, worn smooth where her father's hand had held it thousands of times. For a moment she was 12 years old again, standing beside him as he patiently explained proper stance and breathing techniques. "Respect the weapon," he always said, "but never fear it." The range officer approached her lane, clipboard in hand. He was an older man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he spotted the pistol. "That's a beautiful piece," he commented, genuine appreciation in his voice. "Don't see many classics like that these days." "Thank you," she replied. "It was my father's." "He taught you to shoot?" She nodded, loading a magazine with careful precision, each movement exactly as she had been taught. "Well, I'm supposed to tell all newcomers to start at the 10-yard mark," the range officer said, eyeing her technique. "But something tells me you might want to try 15. She smiled gratefully at him. 15 would be fine, thank you." The range officer adjusted her target, sending it out to the 15-yard mark. From the next lane over, she could feel the champion watching. Probably, waiting to see her make a fool of herself. His friends had gone suddenly quiet, anticipating entertainment. Little did they know that the woman in the simple blue cardigan had spent her childhood and teenage years under the tutelage of a man who had once placed 4th in Olympic shooting trials. Little did they know that before college and career had taken her in different directions, she had been able to outshoot most adults twice her age. And little did they know that she had come here today not just to honor her father's memory, but to reclaim a piece of herself she had set aside for far too long. She picked up the pistol, feeling its familiar weight. 25 years melted away in an instant. She was home. She settled into lane 6, which turned out to be just 2 spots down from the champion and his group of admirers. The proximity wasn't ideal, but she wasn't about to ask for a different lane and draw even more attention to herself. As she carefully arranged her father's pistol and ammunition on the small shelf, she could hear their conversation drift her way. 25 yards again? One of the champion's friends asked him. "Might as well," the champion replied with a casual shrug. "Gotta keep the skills sharp." She kept her eyes on her own setup, methodically checking the pistol's action as her father had taught her. The metal felt cool against her fingertips, familiar and comforting despite the years away. She loaded the magazine with careful precision, each bullet aligned perfectly before being pressed down. The attention from the next lane shifted her way as the men noticed what she was handling. "That's a serious piece for a lady," one of them commented loudly, clearly meant for her to hear. "Colt 1911, right? Gonna have quite a kick." She gave a small nod but didn't engage further. 20 years in corporate offices had taught her that responding to such remarks only encouraged more. Instead, she focused on her preparation, running through the mental checklist that had been drilled into her since childhood. The champion seemed annoyed that she wasn't responding to his friend's baiting. He turned to face her directly. "First time with that gun?" he asked, leaning against the divider between their lanes. His tone was friendly enough, but his eyes held a hint of mockery. "No," she replied simply. "It was my father's." "Well, careful with that recoil, sweetheart," he said with an exaggerated wink. "It's not like shooting those little pistols they rent to tourists." His friends chuckled on cue. One of them, a heavy-set man with a goatee, added, "Maybe she should start with a BB gun instead." More laughter followed as the champion turned back to his own lane and made a show of rapid-firing 6 shots in quick succession. The paper target at 25 yards showed tight grouping right in the center ring. He ejected his magazine with a flourish and turned to his audience, accepting their compliments with practiced modesty. "Just another day at the office," he said with a grin. The range officer approached her lane, watching as she finished her preparations. "You ready?" he asked, his voice kind but carrying a note of doubt. "The safety's on the side there. Make sure—" "I know where the safety is," she interrupted gently, then added, "Thank you," to soften her words. The range officer nodded, slightly taken aback. "Right. Well, Most newcomers start at 10 yards, especially with a hand cannon like that. He nodded toward the 1911. She thought for a moment. 10 yards would be child's play, literally. She'd started at that distance when she was 12, but there was no need to show off right away. "I'd like to try 15 yards first, if that's all right," she said. This request drew the attention of the champion and his friends again. The heavy-set man elbowed his buddy and whispered something that made them both snicker. The range officer raised an eyebrow, but moved to the control panel to adjust her target distance. "Your funeral," he muttered under his breath, though not unkindly. The paper target zoomed out to the 15-yard mark. From the neighboring lane, she could feel eyes watching her, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment of a novice shooter missing completely or being knocked off balance by the recoil. The champion certainly wasn't helping matters. He started, shooting again, this time with slow, deliberate shots that hit the bullseye one after another. Between shots, he would glance over, making sure she noticed his skill. His target at 25 yards showed a cluster of holes that could be covered by a playing card, all centered perfectly. The range officer, who had moved back to observe the champion, nodded approvingly and made a note on his clipboard. "That's 285 so far today," the champion announced to no one in particular. "Might beat my own record again." She took a deep breath and tried to tune them out. Her hands moved automatically through the motions, checking the chamber, inserting the magazine, racking the slide. The weight of the pistol brought back a flood of memories. Weekend mornings at the family cabin's makeshift range, her father standing behind her, guiding her arms into the proper position, his calm voice teaching her to control her breathing. "Half exhale, then pause," he would say. "Find your natural respiratory pause. That's when you're most stable." The champion fired another shot, then deliberately cleared his throat as if to draw her attention to his target. 25 yards is where the real shooters play," he announced, to his friends, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Anyone can hit something at 15. She felt a flicker of annoyance, but her father's words echoed in her mind. "Never let emotion affect your shot. The target doesn't care if you're angry, nervous, or excited." She put on her ear protection and took her position, feet shoulder-width apart with her left foot slightly forward. Her arms extended naturally, elbows slightly bent rather than locked. The sights aligned perfectly with the target downrange, muscle memory taking over despite the years away. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the champion and his friends had paused their activities to watch. The heavy-set man leaned over and whispered something that made the others smile in anticipation. They were expecting a show, but not the kind she was about to deliver. The range officer stood back, arms crossed, also curious to see how this seemingly inexperienced woman would handle the powerful handgun. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and held steady. The front sight remained fixed on the center of the target as her finger took up the slack in the trigger. The world narrowed down to just her, the gun and the target. Everything else faded away. The chronic pain in her shoulder that had bothered her for years, the whispers from the next lane, the grief that had been her constant companion since her father's funeral. All of it disappeared in this moment of perfect focus. The champion finished reloading and glanced over one more time, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth as he prepared to witness what he assumed would be a comedy of errors. "Hope she at least hits the paper," he said to his friends, not bothering to lower his voice. Her finger squeezed the trigger with steady, even pressure, just as her father had taught her thousands of times before. The first shot broke the tension like a thunderclap. The 1911 bucked in her hands, the familiar recoil traveling up her arms exactly as she remembered. But her stance absorbed it perfectly, her body settling back into position almost instantly. Before anyone could react, she fired again and again and again, 6 shots in total, each one delivered with the same calm precision as the first. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath until she lowered the pistol. The range had gone curiously quiet around her. She set the gun down carefully, pointed, downrange, and pressed the button to retrieve her target. The mechanical whir of the target retrieval system seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. She could feel eyes on her, not just from the champion and his friends, but from other lanes as well. The champion's face had gone from smug anticipation to stunned disbelief as he stared downrange, trying to make out her target before it reached her. As the paper target glided closer, the grouping became visible to everyone nearby. 6 holes, clustered so tightly they almost formed a single ragged opening, dead center in the bullseye. The heavy-set man from the champion's group let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be. She took the target down and examined it with a critical eye, just as her father would have done. The grouping was good. Very good considering how long it had been, but not perfect. The second shot had drifted slightly to the right. Her father would have noticed immediately and reminded her to follow through more completely. The range officer approached, his expression a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. That's quite a grouping, he said, studying the target. Especially for someone who hasn't shot in a while. She nodded, allowing herself a small smile. Thank you. The second shot pulled a bit. The range officer raised an eyebrow at her self-criticism. Most people would be thrilled with any one of those shots, let alone the group. From the neighboring lane, the champion had gone suspiciously quiet. His friends were nudging each other, whispering and glancing her way with new interest. She could feel the champion's eyes boring into her, reassessing, recalculating. She reloaded the magazine methodically, her movements unhurried and precise. The familiar routine was soothing, bringing back countless hours spent with her father, at their homemade range behind the cabin. She could almost smell the pine trees and hear the birds singing in the background as he patiently coached her through each step. Mind if I try 20 yards this time? She asked the range officer. He nodded, a small grin playing at the corner of his mouth. Be my guest. He moved to the control panel and sent a fresh target out to the 20-yard mark. The champion cleared, his throat loudly. Beginner's luck, he announced to his friends, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. He turned back to his own lane and fired off 3 quick shots at his 25-yard target. The grouping was good, but not as tight as before. His concentration was clearly affected. She ignored the comment and prepared for her next round. The weight of the pistol felt right in her hands, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. This time, as she took her stance, she felt something shift inside her. The nervous energy that had accompanied her into the range was gone, replaced by a calm focus that felt like stepping back in time. 6 more shots rang out in measured succession, each one a deliberate choice rather than a rushed attempt to prove herself. When she brought the target back, the grouping was even tighter than the first, forming a single ragged hole just above dead center. By now, several shooters from nearby lanes had paused their own activities to watch. Murmurs spread along the firing line. The range officer's eyebrows had climbed higher on his forehead as he examined her second target. You said you learned from your father? He asked, his voice carrying a new note of curiosity. She nodded, feeling a bittersweet pang at the memory. He started teaching me when I was 12. I used to practice with him every weekend until I left for college. Then life got busy and I stopped. Your father must have been quite the marksman. He was, she said simply, her throat tightening slightly. He almost made the Olympic team back in his day. The range officer's eyes widened with sudden recognition. Wait a minute. Was your father Tom from Ridge County? Tom with the custom? 1911? She felt a surge of warmth that someone here remembered him. Yes, that was my dad. The range officer shook his head, smiling broadly now. Well, I'll be. Tom was something else. He used to come here on Thursdays when it was quiet. Always said weekends were too crowded with wannabes showing off. He glanced meaningfully toward the champion's lane. The champion had been listening to this exchange, his expression darkening. He stepped forward, inserting himself into their conversation. So you're not exactly a beginner, he said. It wasn't a question. She met his gaze steadily. I never said I was. 25 yards, he challenged, nodding toward the range. That's where the real shooting happens. The range officer looked like he was about to intervene, but she gave a small nod. I'd like to try that. The champion returned to his lane with a stiff nod, his back rigid with newfound tension. His friends exchanged glances. the atmosphere of their group having shifted dramatically from mockery to uncertainty. The range officer reset both their targets to 25 yards. Other shooters along the line had stopped firing altogether, sensing the unspoken competition unfolding before them. The champion loaded a fresh magazine, his movements sharp and deliberate. He was no longer shooting for fun, he was defending his territory. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes briefly. 25 yards had always been a challenging distance for her with a handgun. Her father had pushed her to master it, insisting that true skill showed at greater distances. "Anyone can hit a target at 10 yards, he used to say. The real test is when you push beyond your comfort zone." Opening her eyes, she raised the pistol and settled into her stance. The distant target seemed smaller than she remembered. The bullseye, a tiny black circle surrounded by concentric rings. She took a slow breath, released half of it, and held steady. The champion fired first, 6 rapid shots that echoed through the range. Without waiting to see his results, he turned toward her with a challenging look. The message was clear. "Your turn." She didn't rush. Instead, she took another breath, found her focus, and squeezed the trigger with deliberate pressure. The first shot felt good, and she followed through naturally to the second, then the third. Each shot built on the rhythm of the one before, muscle memory guiding her hands as they had done countless times over those childhood years. After the 6th shot, she lowered the pistol and pressed the retrieval button at the same moment the champion did. 2 targets glided back along their tracks, a hushed anticipation falling over the entire range. As the targets drew closer, the results became clear to everyone watching. The champion's grouping was impressive, a tight cluster, just off-center of the bullseye. But hers was remarkable, 6 holes forming a pattern the size of a quarter, dead center in the 10 ring. Complete silence fell over the range as both targets reached their shooters. The champion stared at her target, then at his own, his face, flushed with a mixture of emotions, disbelief, embarrassment, and somewhere beneath it all, a grudging respect. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible over the range's ventilation system. She smiled slightly as she took down her target. "Just someone who learned from the best." The range officer cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence that had fallen over the shooting range. "The qualification course is open to anyone who wants to try," he announced, his voice carrying down the firing line. "Though not many do." He gave her an encouraging nod. "Would you be interested?" She hesitated, looking down at her father's pistol. It had been years since she'd attempted anything like a qualification course. Back when she used to shoot regularly, her father had created similar challenges for her, setting up time sequences and position changes to build her skills. But that was a lifetime ago. "What does it involve?" she asked, curiosity winning out over caution. The range officer explained. 30 rounds total, broken into 3 stages. 10 rounds at 15 yards, 10 at 20, and 10 at 25. There are timed sections and required position changes. It's designed to test accuracy, speed, and adaptability. He paused, then added with a small smile. "The current range record is 296 out of 300 possible points. Everyone knew who held that record." The champion stood a little straighter, a flicker of pride crossing his face despite his obvious annoyance at her unexpected skill. "That record stood for 2 years now," one of the champion's friends announced, to the growing crowd of onlookers. Several people nodded respectfully. She considered the challenge. Part of her wanted to gracefully decline and leave with the small victory she'd already achieved. But another part, the part that still held the memories of weekends with her father, his patient coaching and quiet pride in her accomplishments, wanted to see just how much of her old skill remained. "I'll try it," she said finally. "Though, I can't promise it'll be pretty." The champion scoffed quietly. "One good grouping doesn't make you ready for the qualification course." "Everyone's welcome to try," the range officer reminded him firmly. "That's how records get broken." The champion's face flushed slightly at the implied rebuke, but he said nothing more. Instead, he moved back from the firing line, crossing his arms as he prepared to watch. By now, nearly everyone at the range had gathered around, forming a loose semicircle behind the firing line. Word had spread quickly. The unassuming woman, in the cardigan was challenging the course, maybe even the record. The range officer brought out a fresh set of targets and explained the procedure in more detail. First stage is precision fire, 10 rounds at 15 yards with a time limit of 5 minutes. Second stage is timed fire, 10 rounds at 20 yards with strings of 5 shots in 30 seconds each. Final stage is rapid fire, 10 rounds at 25 yards with strings of 5 shots in 10 seconds each. She nodded, mentally calculating the challenge. The first stage would be straightforward enough. The second seemed manageable. The third, rapid fire at 25 yards, would be the true test. Even in her best days, that had been difficult. Each bullseye is worth 10 points, with concentric rings decreasing by 1 point as they move outward, the range officer continued. Perfect score would be 300, which no one has ever achieved here. He glanced at the champion. Current record is 296. The champion wore an expression of studied nonchalance, but the tight set of his jaw betrayed his tension. His reputation was suddenly on the line, challenged by someone who hadn't set foot in a range for years. She checked her ammunition supply, calculating that she would need to reload her magazines. The range officer noticed and brought over a box of rounds that matched what she was using. "On the house," he said quietly. "Tom was always good to us here." The simple kindness nearly brought tears to her eyes. She nodded her thanks, unable to speak for a moment. As she prepared for the challenge, the whispering among the spectators grew. Some were placing informal bets on her score, while others discussed the champion's record in hushed, reverent tones. The champion himself had moved to stand directly behind her lane, where he could observe every move she made. "Ready when you are," the range officer said, stopwatch in hand. She took a deep breath and nodded. The targets were set at 15 yards for the first stage, the familiar black and white circles waiting downrange. She picked up her father's pistol, feeling its weight settle into her palm like it belonged there. "Begin first stage," the range officer announced. The first stage was about precision, not speed. She took her time, focusing on each shot individually, treating each one as if it were the only one that mattered. Her father's voice seemed to whisper coaching tips in her ear, reminding her to follow through, to trust her form, to breathe. The 5 minutes felt both incredibly long and surprisingly short. When the range officer called time, she had fired all 10 rounds. The target was brought forward and the range officer examined it carefully, marking each shot with a pencil as he tallied the score. 96 out of 100, he announced. A solid score, though not exceptional. The champion gave a small snort. "Need to average better than that to beat the record." She ignored him, focusing instead on preparing for the next stage. The targets were reset to 20 yards, and fresh ones sent downrange. The second stage would require faster shooting, but still allowed for careful aim. 2 strings of 5 shots with 30 seconds for each string. "Ready for stage 2, the range officer called. "First string begins now." 30 seconds wasn't rushed, but it didn't allow for the careful deliberation of the first stage either. She settled into a rhythm, squeezing off shots with measured precision. The 1911 responded beautifully, each shot breaking cleanly. When the range officer called time, all 5 rounds had found their mark. After the second string was complete, the target was retrieved and scored. 99 out of 100, the range officer announced, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. One shot had just barely missed the 10 ring, landing in the 9 instead. A murmur ran through the crowd. The champion shifted his weight, uncrossing and recrossing his arms. The final stage would be the real challenge, rapid fire at 25 yards. 10 shots in 2 strings, each string limited to just 10 seconds. Speed and accuracy together, the most difficult combination. "Last stage," the range officer said, setting the fresh targets at 25 yards. "Ready when you are." She rolled, her shoulders trying to loosen the tension that had built there. The rapid-fire stage had always been her weakest. Her father had worked with her on it endlessly, but she had never fully mastered the balance between speed and precision at longer distances. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, though she wasn't at all sure she did. First string of rapid. Fire begins. Now! 10 seconds was barely enough time to fire 5 aimed shots. She moved with controlled urgency, each shot flowing into the next. The 1911 bucked in her hands, the recoil more noticeable now as she fought to reacquire her sight picture between shots. The last shot broke just as the range officer called time. After the second string was complete, there was a heavy silence. As the final target was brought forward, the range officer scored it methodically, his pencil making small marks on the paper. The champion edged closer, trying to see the results for himself. 100 out of 100, the range officer finally announced, his voice filled with disbelief. A perfect score on the rapid-fire stage. The crowd burst into excited chatter. The champion's face had gone pale. Total score, the range officer continued, double-checking his math, is 298 points out of 300 possible. The implications hit everyone at once. She had not only beaten the champion's record of 296, but she had done it convincingly, with a 2-point margin. The range officer turned to face the assembled crowd, raising his voice to be heard above the excited conversations. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new range record. Several people broke into spontaneous applause. The champion stood frozen, his expression unreadable as he stared at the final target with its tight grouping of holes. She felt a curious mixture of emotions, pride in what she had accomplished, gratitude for her father's patient teaching, and a bittersweet sadness that he wasn't there to see it. One of the older men in the crowd approached her with an outstretched hand. "Your father would have been mighty proud," he said, his weathered face creased in a smile. "I used to shoot with Tom back in the day. He always said his daughter was a natural. Guess he wasn't exaggerating." She shook his hand, feeling a connection to her father through this stranger's memories. "Thank you for saying that." The champion still hadn't moved or spoken. His friends stood awkwardly nearby, unsure how to react to this unexpected turn of events. The comfortable hierarchy of the range had been upended in less than an hour, by someone nobody had taken seriously. Finally, the champion stepped forward. The crowd quieted, watching the encounter with interest. He stopped in front of her, his expression still difficult to read. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She looked down at her father's pistol, then back up at the champion. "From the best teacher I could have had," she replied simply. The following weekend arrived with a bright, clear sky and unusually warm weather for the season. The Pine Creek shooting range parking lot was fuller than she had ever seen it, with vehicles spilling into the overflow area across the road. As she pulled her pickup into one of the few remaining spots, she couldn't help wondering if the crowd had anything to do with last week's events. Her answer came as soon as she walked through the front door of the main building. Conversations paused. Heads turned and a few people nudged their companions and pointed discreetly in her direction. On the wall behind the check-in counter, the range record board had been updated. The previous champion's name had been neatly removed, and in its place was a simple entry: 298-300, new range record. Doug at the check-in counter greeted her, with newfound respect, straightening up as she approached. "Good morning. Nice to see you back." His tone was entirely different from the bored indifference of her first visit. "Morning," she replied, placing her membership card on the counter. "Is lane 6 open today?" "Lane 6 is taken, but I've got lane 4 available, or..." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "The champion's lane is open. Lane 10. She smiled at the irony, but shook her head. "Lane 4 is fine, thanks." As she signed in, the front door opened and the former champion himself walked in. The room grew noticeably quieter. He spotted her immediately, hesitated for just a moment, then approached the counter. Unlike last week, there was no entourage following him today. "Morning," he said, nodding to both her and Doug. "Morning," she replied, finishing her signature and stepping aside to give him room. There was an awkward pause as he seemed to search for the right words. Finally, he extended his hand. "I want to apologize for last weekend. I was not at my best." She looked at his offered hand for a moment, then shook it firmly. "We all have off days. 2 years without anyone coming close to my record, and then you walk in and beat it." First try, he said, shaking his head with a rueful smile. That's more than an off day for me. It's a wake-up call. Several people nearby were watching this exchange with undisguised interest. The story of how an unassuming woman in a cardigan had outshot the range champion had clearly made the rounds. Your form is incredible, he continued. I've never seen anyone handle recoil so effectively, especially with a 1911. My father drilled the basics into me until they became second nature, she explained. He always said that flashy techniques might look good, but proper fundamentals win matches. Smart man, the former champion nodded. I'd love to pick your brain sometime if you're willing. Your rapid-fire technique especially. The conversation was interrupted as a young woman approached them hesitantly. She appeared to be in her early 20s, dressed in jeans and a university sweatshirt. Excuse me, she said. Are you the woman who broke the range record last weekend? When she nodded, the young woman continued. I heard about what happened. I've been wanting to try shooting, but I was nervous about coming alone. She gestured around at the predominantly male crowd. I was wondering if you might have any advice for beginners. Before she could answer, another voice joined in. I'd like to hear that advice too. This came from an older woman who had approached from the other side. I used to shoot with my husband years ago, but after he passed, I just stopped. Been thinking about getting back into it. She looked from one woman to the other, suddenly aware that her presence here might mean something beyond just reclaiming a piece of her past. The former champion seemed to sense her surprise and stepped back with a small nod. Ladies, you found the right person to ask, he said, then looked back at her. I'll catch up with you later. My lane's waiting. As he walked away, she turned to the two women and found herself sharing the advice her father had given her all those years ago. The most important thing is to never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here, she began. The gun doesn't care who's holding it. It only cares that you respect it and understand how to use it safely. More people gathered as she spoke, asking questions and sharing their own experiences. What had started as a casual conversation gradually evolved into an impromptu lesson on shooting basics. The range officer, seeing the group, brought over a table and some chairs, creating a makeshift classroom setting in the corner of the reception area. You've got quite the following already, he commented with a smile. I was just answering a couple of questions, she said, surprised by how things had developed. We've needed something like this for a long time, the range officer replied. A lot of people want to learn but feel intimidated, especially when the regulars aren't always welcoming to newcomers. He glanced meaningfully toward the range doors, where the former champion had disappeared. By midday, she had spent more time teaching than shooting, but strangely, she didn't mind. There was something deeply satisfying about sharing the knowledge her father had passed to her. Each time she explained a technique or corrected a stance, she could almost hear him doing the same for her as a young girl. During a brief lull, the range officer approached her again. We've been thinking about starting some beginner classes, he said, especially for women and folks who might not feel comfortable just showing up. Would you have any interest in helping with that? The question caught her off guard. Me? I'm just getting back into it myself. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who remember what it's like to be a beginner, he replied. And after what happened last weekend, you've got instant credibility here. Nobody's going to question your qualifications. She thought about her quiet life before, the office job she'd taken a leave of absence from after her father's passing, the empty evenings in a too-quiet house. Then she thought about the satisfaction she'd felt today, guiding others through those first nervous steps into a skill she had once loved so much. I'll think about it, she promised. Later that afternoon, she finally made it to Lane 4 for some practice of her own. As she unpacked her father's pistol, now wiped clean of the dust that had gathered over years of disuse, she noticed the former champion watching her from Lane 8. When their eyes met, he gave her a respectful nod before returning to his own practice. Word had indeed spread about last weekend's events. Throughout the day, people she'd never met greeted her by name. Some asked for tips, others just wanted to introduce themselves. The same shooting range that had felt so unwelcoming a week ago now seemed like a community, one where she was, unexpectedly, becoming a central figure. Just before closing time, as she was packing up her father's pistol, the range officer handed her an envelope. "Almost forgot to give you this. It's tradition when someone sets a new range record." Inside was a simple certificate commemorating her achievement, along with a gift card for the range shop. What caught her eye, though, was the signature line at the bottom. Instead of just her name, they had added Tom's daughter in parentheses beside it. That small acknowledgement of her father's legacy brought a lump to her throat. She carefully folded the certificate and tucked it into her case, next to the pistol. "He would have been proud," the range officer said quietly. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "I think he would have been." As she drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, she reflected on the strange path that had led her back to the shooting range. What had begun as a simple desire to reconnect with a cherished memory, to honor her father by using his beloved pistol one more time, had somehow opened a new chapter in her life. The record would eventually be broken. Records always were. But what mattered more was the doors that had unexpectedly opened, the chance to teach, to inspire others who might otherwise never have tried, and most importantly, to keep her father's legacy alive not just through remembrance but through action. She smiled as she turned onto the road leading home. Sometimes the best way to honor those we've lost is to share the gifts they gave us. Her father had given her the gift of skill, patience, and perseverance. Now it was her turn to pass those gifts along to others. The next weekend couldn't come soon enough.